Assassin's Creed and DLCs have always gone hand in hand, and to be honest it shows. Outside of the original game and Assassin's Creed Rogue, pretty much every mainline game ended up getting some kind of big expansion. And out of all the DLCs this franchise has had over the years, there's one that easily stands out as the weirdest of them all. Maybe not the absolute best, even though it's definitely in my top 3, but without question the most bizarre. And that DLC goes to Assassin's Creed 3, The Tyranny of King Washington. Now since this DLC came out 13 years ago, there's a pretty good chance you've already played it, but I still wanted to go back and talk about why this expansion feels so strange even today. And looking back at it now is kind of funny, because I remember the sentiment around this DLC wasn't exactly the most positive. Back then, one of the common critiques was the magical powers, and the complete disregard for historical realism, which were way too ridiculous for an Assassin's Creed game. People just did not buy into it. But now, over a decade later, it does feel like public opinion has completely changed. We live in an era where modern Assassin's Creed games are filled with mythological monsters and all sorts of fantasy abilities, so going back to something like The Tyranny of King Washington actually feels refreshing in comparison. It really feels like one of those situations where maybe people did not realize what they had until it was gone. What used to get dismissed as this dumb gimmick now comes across as Ubisoft taking a genuinely creative risk. And hey, let's be honest, you have to respect the fact that they were willing to do something that weird back then. What's even funnier is that the weirdness of this DLC started before it even came out. Originally, the expansion was announced under the working name The Madness of King George. And hey, personally both names sound pretty good, so I don't think much was lost there. The original title was actually a reference to The Madness of King George, which was a movie about the real King George III slowly losing his mind. Now Ubisoft never officially explained why they changed the name, but maybe it was probably done so people would not confuse this completely fictional Assassin's Creed story with, actual history. Now to really understand how truly bizarre this DLC is, we have to look at the actual premise. The whole story completely flips American history upside down. I mean, look at George Washington, who's often remembered as this huge symbol of freedom and democracy, and he gets corrupted by an apple of Eden. And instead of stepping down after becoming president, he crowns himself king and turns America into this, dire monarchy. And that alone already makes for a truly shocking premise. Seeing George Washington of all people stroll around in royal robes, holding this glowing scepter while publicly executing his own bloody citizens feels so uncanny. Especially because back then, Assassin's Creed was still trying really hard to present itself as this grounded historical franchise. So for Ubisoft to suddenly go this far into alternate history and fantasy felt like a massive change at the time. It gets even stranger when you look at Connor's reality in all of this. He wakes up in this world with his original timeline completely intact in his head, but everything around him is just wrong. In this alternate universe, he never actually became an assassin. In fact, the assassin order doesn't even exist here. Instead, he finds out his mother is somehow still alive and actively leading a revolution against the Mad King. Even those animal powers that we get in this DLC, those had a completely different origin during development. I bet you did not know that originally, the developers wanted Connor to get his ghost powers by touching a soul stone that would physically print an animal tattoo onto his skin. But the development team's native consultant absolutely hated the idea, pointing out it did not align with actual traditions of the native people, and he suggested using the sacred red willow tree instead. So instead of magic rocks, Connor ends up drinking hallucinogenic tea to go on trippy vision quests. When I played this DLC back when it came out, it always gave me this trippy sensation. In the back of my mind, I always knew that this wasn't the real in-universe timeline. It feels like this isolated, reality-bending what-if scenario, which is something we almost never see inside Assassin's Creed. It just makes the whole thing feel uncanny. However though, I will say, depending on when you're watching this video, with Black Flag Rising coming out very soon, Ubisoft are introducing these rifts that will show us more of these alternate scenarios. But back in 2013, this was completely uncharted territory. And to add to that whole uncanny dreamlike feeling, there's this really strange change to the game's dialogue that you notice immediately. If you played this DLC right after finishing the base game of Assassin's Creed 3, you'd most likely notice that the native Americans here speak entirely in English, which is a complete gigantic departure from the main game, where they spoke their native Kanyan Kahaka language, which we saw in the subtitles.
Then like you, he will die.
Ubisoft never actually gave an official lore reason for this sudden change, but hey, maybe it's just because it was basically a development shortcut. I mean, the devs did admit that translating and recording the Mohawk language just took way too much time for a tight DLC schedule. And since they already nailed the historical authenticity in the base game, they opted for English here just to keep things moving and focus on the story. And speaking of the story, when you look back at it, it doesn't succeed because it's some masterclass in deep, nuanced writing. If anything, I'd argue it's the exact opposite. This DLC works because it completely leans into the bad trip format and uses it to its absolute advantage. Breaking the DLC story across 3 separate episodes, the infamy, the betrayal, and the redemption, makes it feel like a trippy episodic book, which some can see working, but others not so much. I do actually remember this was one of the big negatives from the critics, because it seemed like the episodic structure back then was not worth the value. I mean, $30 at launch, which is basically $10 per episode. Of course, now the entire DLC comes free with the terrible remastered Assassin's Creed 3, so it's not as bad as it was back then, I guess. I mean, at least you don't need to pay $30 anymore. Anyway, I'm going off topic. Now, I'd say the most genius story choice here is easily how the DLC handles the Founding Fathers. In the base game story of Assassin's Creed 3, these guys were, let's just say very morally grey type of historical figures. But the second the Apple of Eden gets introduced into this DLC, the developers just throw all of that out the window and turn America's heroes into cartoonish tyrannical supervillains. And it works because, again, this is an alternate timeline, so risks like that can be taken and work out quite well. I mean, George Washington himself, the main antagonist here, he's outright full-blown bloody mad. There's even Benjamin Franklin, who's now being controlled like a puppet governor, with none of that charm or humor we often know him for. He's basically turned into this weak, pathetic bureaucrat. Then there's Israel Putnam. You might remember him from the base game, but now he's more like a relentless executioner. Watching these famous symbols of freedom become the people behind so much oppression creates a really interesting conflict in the story. It forces Connor, and by extension us, the player, to wage a second revolutionary war against the very men that we were bleeding for in the base game story for God knows how long. And take this, from a character standpoint, the story is just so incredibly cruel to Connor, which is quite sad to see. I've always felt that Connor is one of the more tragic protagonists in Assassin's Creed. At the same time though, you have to remember that this is an alternate reality, so it softens the blow a little bit, but that's also what makes it interesting. Think about it, Connor's whole purpose in life was protecting his people and protecting his mother, and in the real timeline, he never truly managed to save either of them. But this DLC messes with him by showing him what looks like the perfect reality. He wakes up and suddenly his mother's alive again, his best friend is alive, his village is safe, which then also meant that he never had to go through the pain and trauma of becoming an assassin. And to be honest, isn't it kind of tragic that he then had to witness his mother die twice? Now, yes, even though the second time happens in this weird alternate what-if reality, both of these events still exist as real memories in Connor's mind. To him, both losses happened. And I think that's what makes this DLC way more depressing than people give it credit for. It gives Connor the glimpse at a normal life that he's always wanted, reuniting him with his mother and his childhood friend even, only for the story to violently rip it away from him all over again. It also shows just how dangerous an Apple of Eden can be in the wrong hands. But the script immediately yanks the rug right out from under him. Within like 15 or 20 minutes, Washington murders his mother again, which is just insane, and then later on his childhood best friend is executed right in front of him. At least his best friend had a better death than what he had in the base game, where Connor had to put him down. The deaths in this DLC feel like, how can you say it, a time loop type of punishment. The story essentially forces Connor to relive his greatest psychological traumas in an accelerated hyper-violent loop, making it feel incredibly tragic. And because Connor retains his memories from the actual timeline, he's basically a ghost inhabiting a world that should not exist. He's constantly confused, calling people by names that they don't recognize, and referencing an assassin order that was literally never founded in this alternate universe. Now, as you get into the middle chapters, the story starts changing away from Connor's personal nightmare. This is where the DLC really leans into that surreal rebellion vibe. Connor has to shoot an arrow into Benjamin Franklin just to snap him out of his magical trance, and then team up with Thomas Jefferson to spark a literal second American Revolution. It's definitely something watching Connor coordinate a rebel army to overthrow the guys who originally designed the country. I mean, every interaction feels slightly wrong, but also uncanny. And then by the time you reach the ending of the story, it just goes batshit crazy. The actual climax takes place on a massive stone pyramid that Washington built right in the middle of New York bloody city. I mean, how did anybody at Ubisoft even come to think of the idea? Hey, I know, let's slap the bloody pyramids into New York City. It's such a random thing to think of. We even scale this ancient monstrosity and smash through the glass roof, where we fight a full-blown superhero boss fight against a king who is literally quite mad on power. Now personally, I'd say it's the ending twist that really retroactively cements how brilliant this whole story setup was. The second Connor kills Washington and touches the apple, the entire nightmare collapses. You find out the whole 3-part saga was not some parallel universe or an alternate timeline. Oh well, it was an alternate timeline, but it was more so just a terrifying instantaneous shared vision projected by the Apple of Eden, more specifically when Connor and Washington touched it at the exact same time back at their camp. Now, creatively, that's genius. It turns the entire DLC into a brilliant cautionary tale. Washington wakes up completely horrified by the absolute monster he's capable of becoming. That's if he lets the power get to his head. And then he immediately hands the apple over to Connor, where Connor literally rejects the idea of crowning himself and drops the artifact at the bottom of the ocean. Oh, and fun fact, that specific Apple of Eden was eventually recovered and was later in the possession of the literal 32nd US President Franklin D. Roosevelt. So, hey, another US president. I'm not sure if that was the intention though. I mean, in 1944, that apple was used by Templars to manipulate world leaders during World War II. So yeah, looking back at this DLC today, it's an isolated what-if sandbox that I think Ubisoft really ever allowed themselves to play in. And because it's so creatively interesting, it makes the story feel like a lawless anomaly in the franchise's 17-18 years of history. Now, while the story in the Tyranny of King Washington already feels insanely trippy, it's the gameplay changes that where things really go off the rails. In the base game, Connor becomes dangerous through years of assassin training, learning how to free run, learning how to fight, even mastering different weapons. But in this DLC, Ubisoft says, fuck all of that. Instead, you are now relying on literal magical powers. The game introduces these abilities through something called the Tea Rituals. To unlock each power, Connor drinks a special brew made from the sacred red willow tree, which sends him into these crazy hallucination sequences where he connects with animal spirits. Now, I actually love these hallucination sequences because they were so trippy. For example, take the wolf one. You're following wolves and then stalking an elk, which you then feed to your wolves, all whilst in the hallucination. It's so creative, and you know, man, seeing it now in 2026 really just highlights how creatively bankrupt Ubisoft seems to be, which is just a sad sight to see. The actual power of the wolf ability is great. I mean, it completely destroys the game's stealth system. Connor basically turns invisible, covering himself in this wolf-like camouflage that lets him walk right past enemies in broad daylight and take them out. Assassin's Creed was always about blending into crowds and staying out of sight, but with this power, none of that even matters anymore. But hey, alternate realities, so I loved it. Of course, to stop it from being overpowered, the camouflage slowly drains Connor's health while you still use it. But let's be honest, that barely matters when you can summon ghost wolves to attack entire groups of soldiers whilst you stand there invisible watching it happen. And then you've got the eagle power, and the hallucination gameplay here is just as good. I'd argue this one is my favorite out of the three. You go from protecting the eagle's nest from these jaguars or leopards, I can't tell the difference, and then you literally start flying as an eagle. I mean, that's very cool. These are pretty much tutorial sequences for how to use each power, but they've implemented it quite well that it feels like a natural part of the story. Now, this eagle power is where the game completely abandons the standard Assassin's Creed parkour. Instead of climbing buildings, we literally just aim at a rooftop and instantly launch ourselves across the map like a flying spirit eagle. I mean, why spend time climbing a church tower when you can teleport to the top in like 1 second? You know, thinking of it now, it actually gave me a bit of Dishonored vibes when I played it more recently, like 3 years ago. Out of all the powers, I'd say this was probably the most fun one in the entire DLC. And then there's the power of the bear. Now, the memory corridor here is, I'd say, the most wow factor one, because in what Assassin's Creed game are you climbing a literal, what is that, 100-foot plus brown bear and removing spears from its fur? This power, I'd say, is definitely my least favorite out of the three, and I think that's the common sentiment too, because think about it, there's combat, stealth and parkour. Stealth is cool, parkour is cool, but combat's always been a bit eh. With this bear ability, Connor just slams the ground with massive force, creating these shockwaves that launch enemies everywhere and destroys objects around him. So instead of waiting for counters as we often do with the old combat system, we literally just run into the middle of a fight, activate the bear power and send an entire squad flying through the air. So when it comes down to it, the real legacy of the Tyranny of King Washington DLC is that it proved that Ubisoft could take massive unhinged risks with their biggest franchise and actually pull it off. It was the absolute turning point where Ubisoft realized that they didn't always have to stay inside the historical lines. Without this fever dream of a DLC, I don't think we would have ever got things like the Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon game or the massive mythological underworld expansions in Odyssey and Valhalla. Now sure, those are not everybody's cup of tea, and let's be honest, they did take it a bit too far with the likes of Dawn of Ragnarok and Fate of Atlantis, but hey, it was fun, okay? Fun. I had fun. Fate of Atlantis was quite a good DLC in my opinion. Now if you haven't actually played the Tyranny of King Washington DLC yet, I do highly recommend going back and playing it. I know I just spoiled the entire story for you, but hey, the real joy of this DLC is the absolute carnage of running around the DLC with literal superhero abilities. But I want to know what you guys think. If you have played this DLC back in the day or more recently, do you find yourself enjoying it a lot more now than you did when it first came out? Or do you still think it was just too much of a stupid gimmick for an Assassin's Creed game? Drop your thoughts down in the comments below. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I will see you all in the next one.